The radio crackled with desperate voices as I watched Sheriff Karen slam her patrol car door. 3 injured dogs were bleeding out in a ditch 50 yards away, and she had just blocked the only animal rescue van with her cruiser. The volunteers were pleading with her, showing their emergency permits, but she crossed her arms and shook her head with that cold smile I would come to know too well. That was when I realized this woman was willing to let innocent animals die, just to prove she had power over everyone in this town. The call came in at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. Mrs. Henderson's voice was shaking on the other end of the line as she described the accident on County Road 47. A cattle truck had jackknifed trying to avoid a fallen tree, and the trailer had split open. 3 dogs that had been riding in a pickup behind the truck were hurt bad when debris flew everywhere. I grabbed my emergency veterinary kit and loaded it into my ambulance. 23 years of emergency animal medicine had taught me that the first hour was everything. Internal bleeding, shock, broken bones. These animals needed professional medical care immediately, or they would not survive. The drive out to the accident scene took me through the heart of our small farming community. I had grown up here, gone to veterinary school, and come back to serve the people and animals I loved. Everyone knew everyone else in a place like this. We looked out for each other, helped each other, and never let our neighbors face trouble alone. My ambulance was equipped with oxygen tanks, surgical tools, IV fluids, and pain medication. Everything was organized exactly how I needed it for trauma cases. The GPS showed 12 more miles to the accident site, and I pressed the accelerator a little harder. Time was running out for those dogs. I thought about the network of animal rescue volunteers who worked tirelessly in our county. These were good people who dedicated their weekends to saving abused, abandoned, and injured animals. They had permits, training, and years of experience. When there was an emergency like this, they were often the first responders who could make the difference between life and death. The radio in my ambulance was tuned to the emergency frequency, and I could hear the rescue team coordinator calling for updates. They had already dispatched their transport van and were en route to meet me at the scene. Everything was going according to protocol. We had done this dozens of times before. As I crested the hill on County Road 47, I could see the overturned cattle truck in the distance. The trailer was twisted at an unnatural angle, and there were people gathered around something near the road shoulder. That had to be where the injured dogs were lying. But something was wrong with the scene ahead of me. There was a patrol car parked sideways across the road, blocking the animal rescue van that should have been pulling up to help load the injured animals. I could see people standing around arguing, and my heart sank as I realized this was not going to be the straightforward rescue mission I had expected. I pulled my veterinary ambulance up behind the rescue van and immediately understood the problem. Sheriff Karen was standing in front of the blocked vehicle with her hands on her hips, shaking her head at everything the volunteers were trying to tell her. Her patrol car was positioned to prevent anyone from getting through to the accident site. The rescue team coordinator, a woman named Sarah who had been doing animal rescue for 15 years, was holding up their official emergency response permit. Her voice was getting louder as she tried to reason with Sheriff Karen. "Ma'am, we have full authorization to respond to animal emergencies in this county. These dogs are bleeding and need immediate medical attention." Sheriff Karen looked at the permit like it was a piece of trash. "I do not care what this paper says. I am the law enforcement officer on this scene, and I determine who gets access and who does not." I climbed out of my ambulance and walked over to assess the situation. Sheriff Karen was a woman in her early 50s who had been elected to her position 3 years ago on a platform of tough law and order. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and seemed to enjoy the intimidation factor of her uniform and badge. The injured dogs were visible from where we stood, lying in the grass about 50 yards away. One was a German Shepherd mix that was clearly in shock. Another was a smaller dog that appeared to have a broken leg. The third was bleeding from what looked like a head wound. Every minute we wasted arguing was a minute those animals moved closer to death. "Sheriff, I am the emergency veterinarian," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. "Those animals need immediate medical treatment. Can we please move your vehicle so the rescue team can do their job?" She turned to look at me with an expression that made my skin crawl. It was the look of someone who enjoyed having power over other people and was not about to give it up easily. "I do not know who you people are or what you are really doing out here," she said. "This could be some kind of cover story for drug trafficking or illegal activity. I am going to need to search all your vehicles before anyone goes anywhere." Sarah threw her hands up in frustration. "Drug trafficking. We are trying to save injured animals. Look at them over there bleeding." But Sheriff Karen was not looking at the dogs. She was looking at us with suspicious eyes, like we were criminals instead of people trying to help. I had dealt with difficult officials before, but this was different. This woman seemed to be creating obstacles for the sake of creating obstacles. "I am calling for backup," Sheriff Karen announced, reaching for her radio. "We are going to get to the bottom of what is really going on here." The sound of her radio crackling to life filled me with dread. Those dogs were suffering while this power-drunk sheriff played games with people's lives. I pulled out my phone and started recording everything. Something told me this was going to get much worse before it got better. Within 10 minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived at the scene. Sheriff Karen had called every available deputy in the county, turning a simple animal rescue into what looked like a major criminal investigation. The flashing lights and uniformed officers created an atmosphere of chaos and confusion that had nothing to do with helping the injured dogs. Deputy Martinez climbed out of the first patrol car and walked over to where Sheriff Karen was standing. He was a younger officer who had always seemed reasonable in my previous encounters with law enforcement. But when he looked at the situation, I could see uncertainty in his eyes. "Sheriff, what exactly is the problem here?" he asked quietly. "These people claim to be animal rescuers, but I have my suspicions," Sheriff Karen replied loud enough for everyone to hear. "They could be using this as a cover for illegal activity. I want their vehicles searched thoroughly." Deputy Martinez looked over at the bleeding dogs and then back at the rescue volunteers who were clearly legitimate emergency responders. He seemed uncomfortable with the direction this was taking, but Sheriff Karen was his boss, and he was not about to challenge her authority publicly. The second deputy who arrived was an older man named Thompson who had been with the department for 20 years. He walked over to where I was standing and spoke quietly. "Doc, what is really going on here? This seems like a lot of fuss over an animal rescue." I showed him the emergency permits and explained that we were just trying to get medical attention to injured animals. Deputy Thompson nodded and walked back to confer with Sheriff Karen, but whatever he said to her only seemed to make her more angry. "I do not care what anyone thinks," she announced to the assembled crowd. "I am the sheriff of this county, and when I say these vehicles get searched, they get searched. End of discussion." The rescue volunteers were getting desperate. Sarah was practically begging Sheriff Karen to let them through, pointing at the dogs and explaining that time was running out. But Sheriff Karen just crossed her arms and stood her ground like she was protecting the community from dangerous criminals instead of blocking people who were trying to save lives. I continued recording everything on my phone, making sure to capture Sheriff Karen's face and her exact words. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that this was not about law enforcement or public safety. This was about a person who enjoyed exercising power over others, even when it meant letting innocent animals suffer. One of the injured dogs let out a weak whimper that carried across the field to where we were standing. The sound hit me like a punch to the stomach. That animal was in pain and needed help immediately, but we were stuck playing games with someone who seemed to care more about her authority than about doing what was right. Deputy Martinez kept looking back and forth between Sheriff Karen and the injured animals. I could tell he was struggling with the situation, but he was not willing to defy his supervisor. Deputy Thompson just shook his head and walked back to his patrol car like he wanted nothing to do with what was happening. "Sheriff," I said, trying one more time to appeal to whatever sense of decency she might have had. "Those dogs are going to die if we do not help them soon. Please let us do our jobs." She looked at me with that same cold smile I had seen when I first arrived. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to engage in suspicious activity in my county." That was when I realized Sheriff Karen was not going to back down. She had made this into a test of her authority, and she would rather let those animals die than admit she was wrong. But I was not going to let that happen. I had spent my entire career saving animals, and I was not about to stop now. I walked back to my ambulance and started preparing for what I knew had to happen next. I opened the back doors of my veterinary ambulance and made sure everything was visible and organized. My emergency medical license was posted clearly on the inside wall, along with my credentials from the State Veterinary Board and my authorization to respond to animal emergencies. I had been preparing for situations like this my entire career, even though I never imagined I would need to use legal authority against a corrupt sheriff. Walking back toward the group, I made sure my phone was still recording and positioned myself where everyone could see and hear what I was about to say. Sheriff Karen was still blocking the rescue van, but now she was about to find out that she had picked the wrong person to intimidate. "Sheriff Karen," I said in a loud, clear voice, "I am a licensed emergency veterinarian with full legal authority to respond to animal medical emergencies in this county. Under State Law Section 4729.21, interfering with emergency medical response is a felony offense punishable by up to 5 years in prison." Her confident expression faltered for just a moment. She had not expected anyone to challenge her with specific legal citations, and I could see her trying to figure out if I was bluffing. "Furthermore," I continued, "every minute you prevent these animals from receiving medical care constitutes criminal animal neglect under State Law Section 959.13. You are creating legal liability for yourself and this department with every second that passes." Deputy Martinez stepped forward with obvious concern on his face. "Sheriff, maybe we should let them help the dogs and sort this out later." But Sheriff Karen was not ready to back down. Her face was getting red, and I could see that being challenged in front of her deputies was making her even more angry and irrational. "I do not care what laws you think you know," she said, jabbing her finger in my direction. "I am the sheriff here, and I make the decisions about what happens in my county." That was exactly what I needed her to say on camera. I held up my phone to make sure she could see that everything was being recorded, then spoke directly into the camera. "For the record, it is now 3:47 p.m. on Tuesday, and Sheriff Karen of the County Sheriff's Department is preventing licensed emergency medical responders from treating injured animals. She has been shown proper authorization and has been informed of the legal consequences of her actions. The rescue volunteers realized what I was doing and started recording with their own phones. Sheriff Karen suddenly found herself being documented by multiple cameras as she continued to prevent emergency medical care for dying animals. "You cannot record me without my permission," she said, reaching toward my phone. "Actually, Sheriff, this is a public road and you are a public official performing your duties. Recording is completely legal and protected by the First Amendment," I replied, keeping the camera focused on her face. She pulled her hand back like she had been burned. The legal citations and constitutional references were clearly outside her comfort zone, and she was starting to realize that this situation was spiraling beyond her control. I walked past her toward the injured dogs, and she moved to block my path again. But this time Deputy Martinez stepped between us. "Sheriff, I think we need to let the veterinarian help those animals," he said quietly. "This is not going to look good for the department if those dogs die while we are standing here arguing." For a moment, I thought Sheriff Karen was going to physically fight me to maintain her blockade. Her hands were clenched into fists, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. But she must have realized that assaulting a veterinarian on camera while animals were dying would end her career immediately. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But I am going to be watching every move you make, and if I see anything suspicious, you are all going to jail." She moved her patrol car just enough to let the rescue van through, but she followed us to the accident site like a predator stalking its prey. The real confrontation was just beginning. The German Shepherd mix was in worse condition than I had feared. His breathing was shallow and rapid, indicating possible internal bleeding or shock. I immediately started an IV line to get fluids into his system, while Sarah and the other rescue volunteers carefully loaded the other 2 dogs into transport carriers. Sheriff Karen stood about 10 feet away, watching everything we did with suspicious eyes like she expected us to pull drugs out of our medical kits. Her continued harassment was making an already stressful situation even more difficult, but I focused on saving the animals that were depending on me. The smaller dog with the broken leg was responsive and alert, which was encouraging. I stabilized the fracture with a temporary splint and gave him pain medication to keep him comfortable during transport. The third dog had a head wound that looked worse than it actually was. Head injuries bleed heavily, but this one was superficial and would heal with proper care. Within 30 minutes, all 3 dogs were stabilized and loaded into the rescue van for transport to the emergency animal hospital. They were going to survive, but only because we had finally been allowed to do our jobs despite Sheriff Karen's interference. As the rescue van drove away with its precious cargo, I started packing my equipment back into the ambulance. That was when Deputy Martinez approached me privately. "Doc, I want to apologize for what happened here today," he said, looking back to make sure Sheriff Karen could not hear him. "This is not how we usually handle things, and it is not right that those animals almost died because of politics." I nodded and handed him my business card. "Deputy, if you or anyone else in your department ever needs to reach me about what happened here today, please do not hesitate to call. I have everything documented." He took the card and slipped it into his pocket. "You might want to be careful, Doc. Sheriff Karen does not like being challenged, and she has a long memory for people who make her look bad." That warning stayed with me as I drove home that evening. I had managed to save the injured dogs, but I had also made an enemy of the most powerful law enforcement officer in the county. The question was what Sheriff Karen would do next, and whether I had enough evidence to protect myself and the community from her abuse of power. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and started organizing everything I had recorded. The videos showed Sheriff Karen clearly preventing emergency medical care, ignoring legal authority, and prioritizing her ego over animal welfare. But I knew this was probably not the first time she had abused her position. I started making phone calls to other veterinarians, rescue organizations, and community members. What I discovered over the next few days made my blood run cold. Sheriff Karen had a pattern of harassing people she perceived as threats to her authority, especially those involved in animal welfare and community service. There was the incident where she had arrested a volunteer at the animal shelter on false charges that were later dropped. The time she had threatened to shut down a dog rescue operation because the owner had complained about her rough treatment of a stray dog. Multiple reports of her using excessive force during routine traffic stops, especially targeting people who drove vehicles associated with rescue organizations. Each story I heard added another piece to a disturbing picture of systematic abuse of power. Sheriff Karen was not just having a bad day when she blocked our rescue operation. She was a corrupt official who used her badge to intimidate and control people who were trying to make their community better. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that taking on an elected sheriff would require more than just documentation. It would require courage, persistence, and the support of a community that was ready to demand better from their public servants. I spent the next morning researching the proper channels for filing complaints against law enforcement officers. The state attorney general's office had a special division that investigated police misconduct. The county commissioner's office had oversight authority over elected sheriffs. There was also the state veterinary board, which could file charges for interfering with emergency medical care. But I knew that filing complaints through official channels could take months or years to produce results, and in the meantime, Sheriff Karen would continue abusing her power. I needed something that would create immediate pressure and public accountability. That was when I remembered my neighbor Jake, who worked as a reporter for the regional newspaper. He had been covering local government corruption for 15 years and had built a reputation for thorough investigative reporting. If anyone could help expose Sheriff Karen's pattern of misconduct, it would be Jake. I called him that afternoon and explained what had happened at the accident scene. Jake was immediately interested, especially when I told him about the other incidents I had discovered during my research. "Doc, this sounds like exactly the kind of story our readers need to know about," he said. "Can you send me the video you recorded, along with contact information for the other people who have had problems with Sheriff Karen?" Within 48 hours, Jake had interviewed 6 different people who had been harassed or intimidated by Sheriff Karen. The pattern was clear and disturbing. She consistently targeted people involved in animal welfare, community service, or any activity that she perceived as criticism of her authority. The newspaper story ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, with the headline, "Sheriff Accused of Blocking Animal Rescue, Pattern of Misconduct Alleged." The article included still images from my video showing Sheriff Karen preventing emergency medical care while injured animals suffered nearby. The community reaction was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, the sheriff's office phone was ringing constantly with angry citizens demanding answers. The county commissioner's office received dozens of formal complaints calling for Sheriff Karen's removal from office. But Sheriff Karen's response to the media attention was exactly what I had feared. Instead of acknowledging her mistakes or apologizing for her conduct, she went on the attack against everyone who had spoken out against her. She held a press conference Tuesday afternoon where she claimed that the animal rescue operation had been suspicious and that she had been protecting the community from potentially dangerous individuals. She accused me of being part of a conspiracy to undermine law enforcement and suggested that the injured animals had been used as props in an elaborate scheme to make her look bad. The more she talked, the worse it got for her. Every word out of her mouth demonstrated the arrogance and lack of accountability that had caused the problem in the first place. Local television stations picked up the story, and by Wednesday evening Sheriff Corinne's press conference was being played on news broadcasts across the state. The state attorney general's office announced that they were opening a formal investigation into allegations of misconduct. The county commissioners scheduled a special meeting to review Sheriff Corinne's performance and consider disciplinary action. But the most powerful response came from the community itself. A group of local residents organized a petition drive calling for Sheriff Corinne's resignation. Within 1 week, they had collected over 2,000 signatures from registered voters who were demanding accountability from their elected sheriff. The local animal rescue organizations banded together to create a legal defense fund for anyone who had been harassed or intimidated by Sheriff Corinne. They hired an attorney who specialized in civil rights violations and police misconduct to represent victims and file lawsuits against the county. Sheriff Corinne had tried to use her power to silence critics and cover up her misconduct. Instead, she had created a firestorm of public outrage that was rapidly spinning beyond her ability to control. The community she had sworn to serve was now demanding that she be held accountable for betraying their trust. The trap had been set not by any single person, but by Sheriff Corinne herself. Every abuse of power, every act of intimidation, every moment of arrogance had created the evidence that was now being used to document her unfitness for office. The county commissioners called a special public hearing for the following Thursday evening. The meeting was held in the high school auditorium because they expected a large crowd, and they were not disappointed. Over 300 people packed the seats, with more standing in the aisles and outside the doors. Sheriff Corinne sat at a table facing the audience with her attorney beside her. She was wearing her uniform, but the confident swagger that had defined her personality was nowhere to be seen. The woman who had blocked our animal rescue operation looked small and defensive under the bright lights and scrutiny of her constituents. The commissioners had structured the hearing to allow public testimony, and nearly 50 people signed up to speak. One by one, community members came to the microphone to describe their experiences with Sheriff Corinne's abuse of power. Sarah from the Animal Rescue Organization spoke first, describing how Sheriff Corinne had threatened to arrest volunteers who were trying to save abandoned puppies. Her voice shook with emotion as she explained how the sheriff's harassment had made their life-saving work more difficult and dangerous. Deputy Martinez surprised everyone by requesting permission to speak. He walked to the microphone in uniform and apologized to the community for not speaking up sooner about Sheriff Corinne's misconduct. "I became a law enforcement officer to serve and protect this community," he said. "What happened at that accident scene was wrong, and I should have stopped it. The people of this county deserve better from their sheriff's department." An elderly man named Robert testified about being pulled over and detained for 2 hours because Sheriff Corinne suspected his truck was being used for illegal animal transport. The truck had contained his own hunting dogs, and Sheriff Corinne had no legal justification for the stop, but she had threatened to impound his vehicle and arrest him if he complained. The owner of a local pet grooming business described how Sheriff Karen had conducted surprise inspections of her facility, claiming to look for evidence of animal abuse. The inspections were clearly harassment designed to punish the owner for supporting animal welfare, causes that Sheriff Karen opposed. Person after person came forward with similar stories. A pattern emerged of systematic intimidation, targeting anyone involved in animal welfare, community service, or activities that Sheriff Karen perceived as threats to her authority. When it was my turn to speak, I played portions of the video I had recorded at the accident scene. The auditorium was completely silent as Sheriff Karen's voice filled the room, repeating her refusal to allow emergency medical care for dying animals. "This is not a political issue," I told the crowd. "This is about basic human decency and the oath that law enforcement officers take to serve and protect." Sheriff Karen violated that oath when she chose her ego over the lives of innocent animals. The commissioners gave Sheriff Karen 30 minutes to respond to the allegations. She stood at the podium and attempted to justify her actions, but every word she spoke only made things worse for her. She claimed that animal rescuers were frequently involved in illegal activities and that her suspicions had been justified. She accused the media of bias and suggested that the investigation into her conduct was politically motivated. She insisted that she had done nothing wrong and that the community should be grateful for her tough approach to law enforcement. The audience's reaction was swift and unmistakable. People began standing and turning their backs to Sheriff Karen while she spoke. Others simply walked out of the auditorium in disgust. By the time she finished her remarks, she was addressing a half-empty room of people who had clearly lost all confidence in her leadership. The lead commissioner thanked Sheriff Karen for her statement, then announced that the board would vote on a resolution of no confidence at their next regular meeting. He also informed her that the state attorney general's investigation was proceeding, and that the board was considering hiring an independent investigator to review all complaints against the sheriff's department. As the hearing ended and people filed out of the auditorium, I could hear conversations about recall petitions, lawsuits, and demands for Sheriff Karen's immediate resignation. The community had spoken clearly, and their message was unambiguous. They would not tolerate abuse of power from their elected officials. Sheriff Karen left the building through a side door, avoiding the crowds and reporters who were waiting to ask her additional questions. The woman who had seemed so powerful and intimidating just 2 weeks earlier now looked defeated and isolated. The public reckoning had begun. The state attorney general's investigation concluded 6 weeks later with a scathing report that documented 12 separate incidents of misconduct during Sheriff Karen's 3 years in office. The report found that she had systematically abused her authority, violated citizens' constitutional rights, and created a culture of intimidation within the sheriff's department. The most serious finding was that Sheriff Karen had falsified reports to justify illegal searches and arrests. The incident with our animal rescue operation was just the tip of the iceberg. She had been manufacturing suspicious activity to harass people she personally disliked, then covering up her misconduct with false documentation. Based on the Attorney General's findings, the district attorney filed criminal charges against Sheriff Karen for official misconduct, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. She was arrested at her home on a Tuesday morning and booked into the same jail where she had illegally detained innocent citizens. The county commissioners voted unanimously to request Sheriff Karen's resignation. When she refused to step down, they initiated removal proceedings and hired an interim sheriff to take over the department's operations. Sheriff Karen was suspended without pay pending the outcome of her criminal trial. The civil rights lawsuit filed by the animal rescue organizations resulted in a $2.3 million settlement paid by the county's insurance company. The money was used to establish a legal defense fund for victims of police misconduct and to purchase new emergency medical equipment for animal rescue operations. More importantly, the lawsuit led to comprehensive reforms in the sheriff's department. New policies were implemented requiring supervisory approval for vehicle searches, mandatory body cameras for all interactions with the public, and regular training on constitutional rights and proper police procedures. Deputy Martinez was promoted to interim sheriff and immediately began rebuilding community trust. He instituted regular town hall meetings where citizens could voice concerns about law enforcement, created a civilian oversight committee, and established partnerships with local animal rescue organizations. The 3 dogs we had rescued at the accident scene all made full recoveries. The German Shepherd mix was adopted by Sarah from the rescue organization and became a therapy dog for children in the hospital. The smaller dog with the broken leg found a loving home with an elderly couple who had lost their previous pet. The 3rd dog was reunited with his original owner, who had been searching frantically after the accident. 6 months later, Sheriff Karen pled guilty to 3 felony counts and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. She was also ordered to pay restitution to her victims and permanently banned from holding any law enforcement position. The community organized a celebration at the high school to recognize everyone who had spoken out against corruption and demanded accountability. The event raised money for local animal rescue organizations and honored the volunteers who risked their safety to save abandoned and injured animals. During my speech at the celebration, I reflected on what we had accomplished together. When we saw injustice happening, we did not stay silent. When someone abused their power, we held them accountable. When our community was threatened by corruption, we stood together and demanded better. The experience taught me that democracy only works when citizens are willing to challenge authority and demand accountability from their elected officials. Sheriff Karen had counted on people being too intimidated or too apathetic to fight back against her misconduct. She was wrong. The final chapter of the story came 1 year later, when the county held elections for a new sheriff. Deputy Martinez ran on a platform of community policing and transparency, and he won with over 80% of the vote. His first official act was to establish an annual award recognizing citizens who demonstrate courage in standing up for justice and accountability. The first recipient of the award was Sarah, the animal rescue coordinator who had never stopped fighting for the injured dogs, despite Sheriff Karen's threats and intimidation. As she accepted the plaque, Sarah reminded the audience that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would abuse their power. Today, our county has one of the most respected sheriff's departments in the state. Crime rates have decreased, community trust has been rebuilt, and animal rescue operations are supported rather than harassed by law enforcement. The injured dogs we saved that day have become a symbol of what can be accomplished when good people refuse to let injustice prevail. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or violence, but with cameras, legal knowledge, and the courage to speak truth to power. Sheriff Karen learned too late that in America, no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to enforce it.